Hello, everybody, and this is the inaugural episode of a new series. I haven't come up with a name for it yet. If you want to suggest a name, please leave it in the comments. So, this will be where I look at political ideologies, political parties or organizations, movements, or governments from a fictional work, be it a movie, a video game, a book series, etc. So, the goal here is to kind of analyze them from a political science perspective, look at the social and I guess economic and political and cultural factors that led to this movement, how the movement functioned, and how it, I guess, ended if it did end, what caused it to collapse, what caused it to kind of continue on. And there will be a special focus on trying to draw parallels to the real world. Because in a lot of cases, the portrayal of things in a work of fiction gives us a better idea of how they would actually function than as just pure theory. And that's kind of the basis of science fiction, is to take ideas like, what if humanity met a different species? What if, could we punish people for future crime like a Minority Report? Talking about the evil demon, with Descartes' evil demon with regards to the Matrix. You have all these ideas that you can explore through fiction. I think you can provide a lot more context to. So I find I can learn a lot about political philosophy by reading or watching works of fiction. Even if they're kind of biased, you do get some idea of what the mechanics of it might look like, because to write the work they have to come up with a lot of practical considerations, even if it's just the uniforms, or even it's just like, what would the name of the bureaucracy be that you don't see in just a purely theoretical treatise. So the first one is going to be the New Order from Star Wars. Now, I know we've probably talked about a lot of this in my 2 videos on Palpatine, and I've done a lot of Star Wars videos in general, but I thought this was a really good place to start, because I think the New Order and the Empire in general is probably the most accurate depiction of fascism in a work of fiction I've ever seen. It's also a rather fair depiction of fascism that I think brings out its virtues and its vices better than, once again, I said, just about any other work of fiction I've ever seen. Even the name of it is very accurate. I think Hitler declared a new order, but that was always kind of a recurring theme in fascism, a new order. And that's not really an accident that that it really applies to the empire. And I'll get into kind of a bit more detail in a minute, but I just like to say there's a couple things to just keep in mind about fascism before we kind of get into detail. Firstly, fascism is a syncretic philosophy, a political ideology. It's a combination of reactionary political ideas and progressive political ideas. It's a pretty even synthesis of the two, because in fascist ideology you have a mixture of very right-wing traditional ideas like patriarchy, the heroic individual, hierarchy, the nation, differentiation, traditional gender roles, that sort of thing. The idea of the just very traditional view of the family, and you have this combined with almost a disdain for monarchy, often aristocracy, people who are seen as holding the country back. Futurism was developed out of fascism. Minimalism, I believe, largely developed out of fascism. You have this great optimism and embrace of what's modern and what's new, and this great kind of forward-looking momentum of it. And you have this combination of these two kind of opposing elements under one auspice. And while you probably can't accurately call fascism far right, in truth, it is very much a syncretic philosophy that transcends left and right. The other aspect, I think, of fascism you have to talk about, just briefly before I get into more detail, is the core principle of fascism is the state. And it's fascism is essentially statism, and it's right wing statism in a very real sense. And in practice, it has a lot of similarities with communism. But the thing you have to keep in mind is communism is not necessarily a form of statism in terms of its ideology. Communism is about economic equality. It's about achieving a certain degree of utopian egalitarianism, I guess. But within it, it doesn't really give any special privilege to the state. I think statism and kind of totalitarianism and communism emerged as a result of the failure of their ideas to actually work in reality. And so to try to force their ideas to work because people wouldn't willingly accept them, they had to turn to massive state power and state socialism. But in communism, it's kind of a means to an end. It's kind of a necessary consequence of their ideas not working. Whereas in fascism, I view the state as being the center. Mussolini said nothing above the state, nothing outside of the state. Fascism is the worship of the state because it views the state as being the nation. And more than that, the state kind of has what would be the term, an ontological or metaphysical existence beyond the people within the nation. It's viewed as kind of almost a deity of sorts. So those, I think, are the two major points I just wanted to get in. So let's get into what the New Order was. So the New Order was something Palpatine declared at the end of the Galactic Civil War. The Galactic Civil War had, well, I guess the Clone War, if you want to use that term. It was a civil war, though. Had occurred when, as a result of a number of different political factors, just briefly going into it. The Republic, for thousands of years, had a problem where the bulk of the population and wealth had been in the core worlds. The worlds fairly close to the center of the galaxy. They tended to be pretty tightly packed together, and the overwhelming majority of the Republic's population lived there. Most of the economics was there. And as such, they had an absolute majority with regards to voting. And over time, more and more constitutional amendments were passed that gave more and more disproportionate voting power to the core worlds. And the outlying kind of systems of the galaxy, the expansion region, the outer rim, the mid rim, were kind of exploited by the core. It was fairly common if you look at the Darth Bane novels. A lot of the outlying planets were basically just economic colonies run by core world governments who could not use labor standards like that on their own planets. They basically would use company towns, slave labor, indentured servitude. They would just basically kind of rape and pillage in a legal fashion the other systems. And there's also a species aspect to the whole thing. The core worlds are majority human. Many of them, like Coruscant, are overwhelmingly human. And because humans are the largest single species in the galaxy by a large margin, but are not, to my understanding, anywhere near a majority of the Galactic Republic, I'd imagine they're probably like 30% of the Galactic Republic. So they're a plurality, but they're not a majority. There was a tendency, because they were so dominant, that humans tended to have a certain degree of a sense of superiority over other species. And this, to a certain extent, extended to other near humans as well. Near humans being like the Chiss, being the Dathomiri, Zabraks, just other very humanoid, human-looking species that were closely related to humans and could breed with humans. So you had this kind of, I guess you could call it subtle racism or subtle speciesism. And I use that term unironically, combined with viewing the kind of the outer and mid-rim worlds as being backward. And over time, the situation just kind of got worse and worse. After Rusan and the Republic had disbanded its fleets and army, there was really nothing left to protect the poorer systems from being raided by pirates and mercenaries and stuff like that. The core worlds could all afford their own security forces, but the outer rim couldn't afford any of these things. And there was also, as I said, a species aspect to this. So when Count Dooku showed up, a great deal of the separatist cause came from resentment at the kind of outer and mid rim and how it had been kind of mistreated or ignored by the core worlds, but also if you notice, most of the separatists were non-humans. There was a desire to leave and kind of found a non-human majority rival state that would more or less address their grievances. And as the war went on, the human centrism would grow more and more prominent. It had become especially prominent near the end of the Republic, and it would become increasingly prominent as the Republic army was made up of cloned humans. More and more of the upper bureaucracy and the ruling class became humans as the war progressed. And that was really something Palpatine leveraged in building a support base, was appealing to a movement called human high culture. Human high culture was a movement that basically stated that human culture was superior and that humans kind of had a duty to civilize the rest of the galaxy. So over the course of the Clone Wars, increasingly the galaxy just wanted an end. They wanted order, they wanted stability. The Republic had become incredibly weak over time. In the aftermath of Rusin, 1,000 years before the events of the Phantom Menace, the Republic had seemingly defeated the Sith once and for all and had disbanded all of its armies. It had basically become increasingly even more decentralized, I suppose you could say, over time. Or it was kind of interesting because it was more decentralized, but it's kind of implied taxes were higher and the bureaucracy was growing, but it wasn't providing the security it used to anymore. Regardless of the origins of it, eventually Palpatine was able to declare the New Order and transition the Republic into the Galactic Empire, which was more or less overwhelmingly popular as his centralization of power had been. So upon being established, the Empire became more or less almost overnight a fascist state. And I think a very accurate portrayal of a fascist state. So let's kind of go into what some of the parallels are. Firstly, we do have a dominant cultural ethnic group and a chauvinism towards members of different cultural ethnic groups. And I use that term purely as a descriptive, not as a normative. The Empire, the New Order, had, as part of its official ideology, human supremacy. The Imperial Navy, the Imperial Army, was staffed almost entirely by humans. There were some near humans like Thrawn who were allowed to participate, but even then they were viewed as second-class citizens. But they were still citizens as opposed to non-human species like the Wookiees and similar ones. So there was extreme human chauvinism. In many cases, non-humans were enslaved, repressed, or dispossessed of their property. Now, I have my issues with that largely because if you're operating a galactic level civilization in which a large majority are not of a certain species, it's kind of a recipe for civil war and disaster. But I digress. So you have that. You have the... So you have that. You also have a focus on masculinity, on heroic action, and on military. Despite the fact that the Galactic Empire, prior to the Galactic Civil War, really didn't have any enemies it was fighting, the culture became almost entirely military. Most civilians started wearing military-style uniforms. Despite Moffs being a civilian position, they wore military uniforms. Most bureaucrats wore military uniforms. Public music became increasingly militaristic, as did most symbolism. So even though there was no war, it was viewed as the highest calling in society was to be a soldier. It was to be a man of action. It was to be a fighter for the Empire. And as such, service was strongly encouraged. It was encouraged for all men to do a tour of service in the Navy or the Army, to adopt kind of military aspects into their daily lives. Everything was talked about as like the coalition for progress, the alliance for something or other, Everything just had a very military feel to it, even when it wasn't at war. And that's something we see in pretty much every fascist regime, is the erasure of any sort of barrier between the civilian and the military, because fascism is extremely patriarchal. I know one of the terms they talked about in the New Order is they called it human supremacy, meaning it was human but also also male dominated. So you have that aspect to it. Now, on the subject of the aesthetics of the Empire, and this is extremely important, Palpatine's personal taste was minimalism. Palpatine liked minimalism, but he also liked grandiosity. And this is something you see very commonly in fascist architecture. If you look at a lot of like the Albert Speer stuff, if that's his name, yeah, it's very plain. A lot of it, it's concrete, it's gray, it's black, it's white, but it's huge. And that's kind of, I think, describes a lot of, just if you look at it, it's very grand, it's very large, but it's also kind of very minimalist and kind of boring. And there's a couple reasons for that. And minimalism is kind of a fascist thing because, on one hand, building these grand things promotes the glory of the state. On the other hand, colorful ostentatiousness is a sign of weakness. So you have grandiosity, excess, power. These are all things that glorify the state. But like color, frills, fanciness, delicacy, these things are all seen as forms of cultural degeneracy. They're effeminate, they make people weak. So if you look at this, this is very common in Imperial aesthetics because Palpatine loved minimalism. You have Star Destroyers, which are some of the largest ships ever produced, but they're just wedges. They're very simplistic in design compared to some other craft like Mon Calamari cruisers. They're very boring looking. TIE fighters are very impressive, but they're this boring industrial design. You have just most of the things the Empire builds, be it the Death Star, be it AT-ATs, be it whatever, is this boring gray blocks, just completely lacking in anything fancy. But they're these massive, impressive machines of death. And that's kind of a core theme of fascism that I think people underestimate. Fascism is as collectivist as communism. It's just collectivist for a different purpose and in a different way. Because in fascism, it's collectivist in service of the state. And this can also be seen in other Imperial uniforms. Pretty much all Imperial uniforms tend to look very similar. They're extremely simple, extremely minimalistic. Even Tarkin's uniform is extremely simple, despite the fact that he's a Grand Moff and controls like hundreds or thousands of star systems. So everybody more or less wears the same uniform as a form of conformity. Now there is rank, etc., but the rank is something that's given to you by the state for the benefit of the state. The rank doesn't reflect on you personally at all. So it's your rank is there to glorify the state, but you don't have any ostentatious aspects of it. So there's a very rigid disciplinary structure, but at the same time, it's within a very collectivist organization. So even you never see anyone really wearing medals, wearing declarations, wearing fancy unit stuff. You just see the boring rank plaques and the boring uniforms, because that's really all that matters. Is individualism is a very negative thing because it detracts from the unity of the state. And yeah, so we have that aspect of it that I think is very important. You also have, I suppose, the ruinous amount of military spending and a focus on bigger is better as opposed to really efficiency. Just getting to this for a second. Like, this was a problem they had during World War II, where Hitler wanted the mouse, he wanted the rat, he wanted these like massive impractical tanks that were too expensive that wouldn't work, as opposed to work just building more, I don't know, more Panthers or more Panzer IVs or more Stugs or designs that worked. They just kept building these more and more ostentatious things. They built more and more super weapons. And I think they kind of put in Star Wars they kind of made reference to the Nazi obsession with super weapons like the V2 and like the flying wing and just these impractical things that were really impressive but didn't really have much of a practical use. The Death Star is kind of like that because the amount of resources that built the Death Star could have built thousands of Star Destroyers. The Super Star Destroyers were also a waste of resources. It was putting too many eggs in one basket. You could build dozens of Imperial class Star Destroyers, which would have just as much firepower, but would have a much lower chance of being destroyed all at once. But it's the idea is to glorify the state, to glorify the nation through that. The New Order also partook in on this theme extensive state terrorism. That is, there is a lot of secret police, a lot of people were arrested, there was a lot of kind of arbitrary uses of power. Now, I've been thinking about it, and I think the purpose of state terrorism is to destroy the individual and to remind the individual that there's nothing above the state, that they have no rights. The only thing that has rights is the state. And this is true. This is a very good example of this is the Cardassians in Star Trek. Because the Cardassians in Star Trek, their favorite genre is murder mystery. And in every Cardassian murder mystery, everybody is guilty and the supremacy of the state is upheld because the state executes all of them. All Cardassian trials are show trials where they basically, the accused has to make a speech about how they've sinned against the Cardassian state. So this is also very true in Star Wars. The idea is there's a random element to the violence, so no one believes that their unique talents or their unique abilities or their position makes them indispensable, because they're all dispensable, because the only thing that matters is the state, or Palpatine, who is the physical embodiment of the state in human form, kind of like he's a god emperor, more or less. But you have that aspect to it. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. When Tarkin blows up Alderaan, it doesn't matter to him. The loss of the Death Star doesn't matter. The deaths of soldiers don't matter, because individual life is meaningless before the state, which is the sole focus of a fascist society. So it's basically kind of like clipping your toenails, etc., when individuals die. It's very similar to communism. It's just hierarchical. It's not concerned with equality. It's concerned with order and collective glorification and glory and honor, as opposed to equality. So this brings us to COMPNOR, or the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order. So COMPNOR was the only political party that was permitted during the Empire. COMPNOR was a patriotic organization that Imperial citizens were encouraged to join, and that if you were a member of, it would make it easier, like when you're joining the army, you might get a higher rank to start with, or it would help you get a job in the bureaucracy. So there's like a COMPNOR youth league. There was a bunch of COMPNOR had its own intelligence services. It had its own charities. It was basically a civil society that was controlled by Palpatine and one of the Grand Admirals, and its entire purpose was the maintenance of everything and to provide the Empire with a lot of spies. So if you joined it, it's kind of funny because you got a subscription to a magazine called Iron Will. Once again, in reference to like Triumph of the Will. So, COMPNOR, COMPNOR security forces and their intelligence was looked down on by the rest of the army. It nevertheless really provided the Empire with a lot of control of the ground game. And that's kind of part of fascism, is it's not just government. It's not just the army. It's a totalitarian ideology. It's supposed to be relevant in all aspects of life, not just in terms of how government functions or how the economy functions, but how the individual family functions. It's once again, it's different than communism because it doesn't posit things like feminism or birth control, etc. It supports the traditional family. But at the same time, once again, these things are all pragmatically exist only to serve the state. And in this case, everything about the empire only existed to serve the government of the galactic empire. It's the individual worlds, the individual people, even the highest ranked military officers were all completely irrelevant. The only person who ultimately mattered was Palpatine, who was the physical embodiment of the state. So within a fascist government, there's room for one person to kind of serve as the physical representation of the nation, but beyond that, there really isn't anything else. And kind of inevitably, what this sort of society produces is extreme centralization. Because, as I've talked about before, there's kind of a trade off between centralization and decentralization. Centralized societies are much more capable of mustering all of their resources, all of their abilities, all of their strength. They're able to exploit their resources more efficiently. They're able to draft and withhold a bigger army more efficiently. They can tax more efficiently. A smaller, highly centralized society can defeat a larger decentralized society. The problem with centralization, though, is it leads to a situation where everyone's extremely specialized and there's a very complicated, often Byzantine bureaucracy and structure that runs everything. And it's very unstable, particularly if it's held together by a charismatic individual with exceptional talents. Once that individual dies, it often turns into a power struggle. And you have these huge navies and these huge fleets and a huge military, which it doesn't really have any checks and balances on its use, so it tends to lead to civil war almost immediately. Whereas decentralized societies have a lot more trouble dealing with these things, but they're innately extremely stable because there's no real reason for any of the constituent parts of it to secede, and very often they'll resist very strongly in the case of in the case of a foreign invasion. The Republic had been beaten horribly many times, but it was never really in danger of collapsing. I mean, it did almost collapse during the new Sith Wars, but that was militarily. The only times it's really faced collapse is from an external threat. And even in the case of the Clone Wars, that was because the Sith had been manipulating it and had basically caused it, and they're kind of an external threat. Because all the worlds in the Republic were able to pretty much do their own thing, they really were pretty happy with the situation and had no real desire to leave or change the status quo. Whereas with the Empire, everything was centralized in the position of Palpatine. And as with most real-world fascist regimes, be it Hitler's Germany, be it Mussolini's Italy, be it most of them, Francoism isn't really the same thing as fascism, but we can use it as an example. Once kind of the charismatic leader with the exceptional abilities died, these states completely collapsed into dust. Now, part of that is because of external invasion, but I kind of feel if Nazi Germany, if Hitler had have died of natural causes, the regime would have rapidly deteriorated. Probably, I don't know, into some kind of more conventional military junta or something. And that's kind of what happened with Palpatine. Once he collapsed, it was seen as the death of the state. And as that happened, there's not really any loyalty outside of that. There's not really social bonds, community bonds. There isn't really a religion. That's another interesting thing to keep in mind. Palpatine's Galactic Empire had state atheism, and most fascist countries have some aspect of forced secularization. Even in the supposedly clerical fascist states, in a lot of cases, religion exists only for the glorification of the state. It's there. That's its primary purpose. even if most of the members of the government are ostensibly of that religion. I do think there's some truth to the idea that their true God is really the state in and of itself, and religion is kind of a secondary thing that's associated with it for historical reasons. So that's kind of another interesting thing. But there was really nothing holding Palpatine's empire together beyond force and beyond his unique abilities holding it together. The Old Republic was held together by culture, by personal friendships between client and patronage, by tradition, by just a lot of history behind it and a lot of just established social institutions. And the empires were all based on a contrivance. They were all an attempt to build a completely new society and to completely break with the past. And the result of all such projects are inevitably they fall apart. So I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you have any idea what to call the new series, please let me know, and I'll talk to you guys later.